Release all journalists being held overseas. Free speech, free press. What about ones you disagree with? Release all journalists that you agree with overseas. The other ones, just leave them in prison. Hello there, you 6.4 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on this magnificent voyage that we are taking together to truth and freedom. In order to achieve it, we have to have coordinates that we can agree upon, principles that we rely on. We can't be hypocrites that say, we want free speech, but not from people who we disagree with. Joe Biden, you'll remember in his press correspondence dinner propaganda thing, said we should release journalists. It's disgusting to have journalists held for reporting the truth. Meanwhile, there's a journalist being held in Ukraine, and no one seems to be talking about that journalist and their right for freedom. So is this another example of hypocrisy? We support free speech when we agree with them. We don't support free speech when we disagree with them. That's the most important one, isn't it? Surely, for all of us. I mean, these principles are incumbent on all of us. Let's have a look at this news story.
The free press is a pillar, maybe the pillar.
Do you think he said that because there's a pillar in his eye line? The free press is a pillar, or a window with a lamp in it and some railings.
The free press is a pillar, maybe the pillar of a free society, not the enemy. Thomas Jefferson wrote...
No, because Thomas Jefferson
wrote, "We're left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government. I should not hesitate to prefer the latter."
That's not a principle that they realistically espouse. They've just been busted for bothering social media sites that publish dissenting information. Believing in free speech means you believe in the free speech of people that disagree with you. That's a very difficult thing to commit to, because I think all of us would prefer to go, no, shut up, I don't want to listen to you, I don't agree with you. But it's particularly relevant when you're legislating. It's particularly relevant when you're censoring. It's particularly relevant when campaigning for the release of one journalist who happens to represent your views, but ignoring another journalist who you may disagree with.
Our message is this: journalism is not a crime.
Julian Assange was 52 the other day. Try telling him that journalism isn't a crime. You won't be able to, because you won't be able to get a visit.
Evan and Austin should be released immediately, along with every other American held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad.
Every other one. So there you go. That's the criteria. Are you a journalist? Yeah. Are you in prison abroad? Yeah, good, because we've just established a principle that, unless it's lies, is going to help you. Biden devoted the bulk of his remarks to a lengthy declaration of his opposition to the repressive measures taken against journalists in Russia, China, Iran, Syria, and Venezuela. Have those countries got anything else in common? Russia, there's proxy war. China, planned for war. Iran, planned for war in Donald's secret boxes. Syria, droning them the whole time. Venezuela, they got oil that they shouldn't have. It's not very good oil, but we want it anyway.
We would have gotten all that oil, it would have been right next door.
And pledges to devote US diplomatic efforts to winning the release of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, recently arrested on bogus spying charges in Russia, and other American prisoners of the Putin regime. They should be released. Evan Gershkovich ought be released. Show me what to sign. Tell me what to do. Of course, I agree that it's wrong that someone that was in Russia investigating Russian corruption is currently in prison. He should be released. I support his release. What I don't support is using those stories to push an agenda while ignoring comparable cases, because you can't use them to exploit or amplify a message that's convenient to you, or to vilify or criminalise a country that you want to have wars with or want to ransack for resources. That makes you think that they don't actually care about Evan Gershkovich. Do they? Do they care about Evan Gershkovich, or are they using him? Let me know in the comments. The coincidence between the list of countries guilty for violating press freedom and the list of countries targeted by American imperialism for subversion and overthrow was obvious. Yes, because it's the same list. That's why it's so obvious. It's like when people say that Harry Potter and Star Wars is the same story. A little Jedi, stroke wizard, is helped by Hagrid, stroke Ben Kenobi. Then he finds out that Voldemort, Darth Vader, is actually his dad. It's the same thing. It's the same bloody list. So we're using this speech, of course, to illustrate the hypocrisy of saying that all journalists should be freed and only focusing on journalists that you agree with. Of course, Evan Gershkovich should be freed. But what about Gonzalo Lira? Let's have a look at why those cases are being treated differently. Meanwhile, a United States citizen has been arrested in Ukraine for allegedly expressing strong criticism against the government's war with Russia, and the Biden administration said on Monday that they will not comment on the matter. What Why not? Why won't they comment on the matter? Why won't they comment on the matter? Because it's not convenient? Because it's not consistent with what they're pushing elsewhere? Gonzalo Lira, a writer and YouTuber who has been an outspoken critic of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky,
Hello, Vladimir.
was arrested earlier this month. The Ukrainian government has charged Lira with violating sections 2 and 3 of Article 4362 of Ukraine's criminal code, which prohibits portraying the military conflict in Ukraine as an internal civil conflict, the outlet reports. If convicted, Lira faces up to 13 years in prison.
A U.S. citizen who was residing in Ukraine has been arrested. Are you guys aware of this? How do we feel about our allies, detaining U.S. citizens for speech abroad?
I will say in general that we're aware of the report. We obviously support the exercise of freedom of speech anywhere in the world, and I'll leave it at that.
I'll leave it at that, but we won't back it up with actions. That's how government works these days, isn't it? I'll just tell you what I've already told you, but not do anything that would demonstrate that I actually mean it or care about it. Seems like a perfectly reasonable question. There's an American citizen who's being detained in Ukraine who are an ally. What are we going to do about that? Because it's against our principles. Well, I'll just tell you again, that's wrong. So you're going to do something? No, nothing. But if there's someone that you can use for publicity, we'll do something about that. So is it then that you just use these principles and maybe even wars themselves if you already have an agenda? Because I can't help but notice that Russia, China, Iran, Syria and Venezuela, the countries that you've said are particularly bad when it comes to press freedom, also seem to have stuff you want. No, they don't, but I'm not willing to prove that or comment on it, so shut up.
So you guys aren't working to get him released?
I'm going to leave my comments where I just left them.
I'm going to leave my comments where I just left them there, floating about, sort of looking a bit like lies and excuses. Actually, I'm going to move. Let's get those comments out of here. In March 2022, President Volodymyr Zelensky invoked his emergency powers under martial law to suppress several opposition political parties and implement a unified information policy, i.e. nationalised TV news. Unified information. That is a propagandist way to describe propaganda. Should we unify information? Yeah, let's unify. You don't want information all scattered about, arguing with each other. That's centralising the control of communication, information. That's terrible. So someone who disagrees with it, like, hey, I don't agree with that, you might have to go to prison for not unifying information. We can't continue to bring you complex dialogues about the nature of free speech unless we're sponsored by someone, unless we have commercial partners that are willing to support us in this bold and sometimes risky endeavour. Here is a message from one of them. Watch it and actually use it if it's something that you want or need. If you don't want or need it, well, I mean, how can I recommend you, but if you do need it though. We can't make our wonderful content or put on events like Community without our wonderful sponsors. Mudwater is a coffee alternative with 4 adaptogenic mushrooms and Ayurvedic herbs. Plus, it contains only a fraction of the stinking caffeine in a dirty old cup of coffee. So you get the energy without them terrible jitters, baby. And wouldn't you love to have the hit of coffee without that crash? Each ingredient in here was added for a purpose. They don't just put things in for a laugh. Cacao and chai for mood and a hint of caffeine. Lion's mane to support focus. Cordyceps to support physical performance. Chaga and reishi to support your immune system. And cinnamon, dirty Christmassy filth, for antioxidants. It tastes like masala chai and cacao made a really healthy lolly baby. Mudwater is Whole30 approved, thank God. 100% USDA organic, non-GMO, gluten-free, vegan and kosher certified. Mudwater donates monthly to the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics as they believe the country is in a mental health epidemic and sees psychedelics as a useful tool for individuals with depression, PTSD, anxiety and other mental health experiences. To get 15% off, go to mudwater.com/community. Use the code community15. Delicious. In January, Zelensky passed the bill, meaning that it will be able to regulate all media in Ukraine. All! So you're not allowed to have media in Ukraine unless it's regulated. So is this the freedom that we're fighting for? Of course, what they'll say is, it's temporary under pressure. No one's saying that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not criminal, but that's authoritarianism, isn't it? You can't have American taxpayer dollars being poured into Ukraine to fight against a criminal entity without there being some provisos and conditions placed upon that that. Otherwise, there's no purpose to what you're fighting for. You have to look at the nuances and complexity of the situation. Russia's invasion, criminal and bad, but seemingly provoked over time. Ukraine's authoritarianism doesn't seem good. If journalists can't question what the state are doing, then what is it we're defending? We have to defend because Russia are bad. Yeah, but hold on, isn't that also bad? Shut up, we ain't got time for that. That's the obligation you have. Otherwise, there's no purpose to anything. And we all start to think, well, what are we fighting for? Think about during the pandemic. Oh, we're all locked down. Why is it? Oh, because we're helping people. But are we helping people if they tested that? Shut up, shut up. Things don't make sense anymore. Information's being controlled. Information's being centralized. Information's being censored. You can't question that or you're one of the baddies. You're not patriotic. Didn't they used to be the right wing? Shut up, it's the left wing now. The whole thing is like a sort of a giddy delirium of language, and I believe it's because it's not anchored to any principles except for the agenda of dominion, control, and profit. Those are the only things where I can sort of consistently track, oh, well, that's beneficial to those interests. Oh, that's also beneficial to those interests. That's the only thing that makes sense. When I try to make sense of it using, well, we're helping Ukraine because it's wrong and it's a humanitarian crisis, immediately a load of questions come in my mind. What about the people in Yemen? What about the people in these various territories that we've exploited ourselves? You can't hold it in your head if you ask those questions. That's why you're not allowed to ask those questions. Under previous legislation enacted in 2019 under the Zelensky government, the council has the power to issue licenses, conduct inspections, and impose sanctions on television and radio companies, Ukrenews reported. The new law allows the council to regulate print and online media, as well as internet, television, and information sharing platforms such as YouTube and social networks. The regulator will be able to impose mandatory orders and fines and even suspend media outlets without a court decision. Under the law, the council can also restrict content from search engines such as Google. It's interesting that already the post-war future in Ukraine has been discussed. Zelensky making a deal with BlackRock,
JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs
to make it a digital company that's fully regulated and fully controlled, where there are no union laws. Increasingly, it looks like this is not about protecting the people of Ukraine. It's about advancing a certain set of interests, the pursuit of certain resources, the ability to pilot new legislation and social models, break down Russia as an international threat. All those arguments make more sense to me than we care about Ukrainian people. Diplomacy would be much higher up the agenda if that was the objective. Both the European Federation of Journalists and the Committee to Protect Journalists have opposed the measure, and in September, Ukraine's own National Union of Journalists called the law the biggest threat to press freedom in Ukraine's independent history. So if you believe and agree with what Joe Biden said, that in the case of America and in the words of Jefferson, the press is more important than the government, what he was saying then is free speech. Jefferson's principle applied now means you wouldn't censor social media, you would allow people to freely communicate. Of course, you then have to, if you agree with that, you have to recognize that this is wrong and that the reason to protect Ukraine is because you believe in freedom. And if you believe in freedom, then measures like that are hypocritical and at odds with that principle. And questioning that, pointing that out, is important, vital, necessary. Otherwise, the central meaning is being pulled away, and all that remains is a set of very obvious financial interests and interests of dominion, which are obviously, as you surely know by now, what I believe motivates conflict of this nature. But perhaps more observably, what about the freedom of that guy that's banged up there, Gonzalo Lira? That's not abstract. That's a person now who's in prison as a result of these laws that the Ukraine's own National Union of Journalists think is wrong. What do you think about that? How do you reconcile that with the billions of dollars of aid? I suppose this is what they'd say. Look, there's this massive war going on. We've got to win that war. And I don't know, man. I can't get it up for that argument because I just don't trust them. And the reason I don't trust them is because I see how these things play out all the time over time. In May, members of Zelensky's Servant of the People Party introduced a bill to criminalise the spread of false information. This sounds familiar. On the internet and through social media that violates Ukraine's national security. They're doing it everywhere. Ostensibly, the bill is targeted at bot accounts, but in reality, the language of the bill is so encompassing that anyone could be arrested for posting information that the right-wing nationalist government in Kiev deems misinformation. Another one of those laws that seems to be the recognition that information can now be disseminated in ways that is difficult to control unless there are new laws to control it. And it's not about misinformation, it's about information that's not expedient.
To the entire family, everyone in this hall stands with you. We're working every day to secure his release.
Biden made no reference, for example, to the murder of Washington Post commentator Jamal Khashoggi, killed and dismembered inside the consulate of Saudi Arabia in the Turkish city of Istanbul. I wonder why they don't even notice that. What is it? They don't know or they don't care? It has to be one of those. Biden claimed during the 2020 election campaign that he would turn the Saudi leader into a pariah.
The pariah that they are.
Instead, in pursuit of greater Saudi oil production, he went cap in hand to Riyadh for talks with the prince/assassin. 3 minutes into his remarks at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, Biden declared journalism is not a crime. It is noteworthy that in their coverage of the Correspondents' Dinner, neither the New York Times nor the Washington Post or any other mainstream publication made any mention of Assange or the contradiction between Biden's declaration of fidelity to the First Amendment and the continued drive of his administration to extradite and jail Assange. Is there any clearer metaphor for the set of problems that we now face? Ukraine is passing laws to centralize and control information. That's a propaganda unit. Joe Biden holds an event where the room is full of journalists, where he tells that room that journalism, in the words of Jefferson, is more important than government. Meanwhile, not one journalist in that room has the temerity to say, what about Julian Assange? What about that guy banged up in Ukraine? Do we care about journalism and free speech, or do we care about propaganda? And have we become so good at propaganda that we tell you that our propaganda is your free speech? That we tell you that a free press is a press that does exactly what the government wants them to do and doesn't ask the government any difficult questions. And when a difficult question is asked, like, hey, what are you going to do about that YouTuber who's banged up in Ukraine? Just say, look, I've told you what I'm going to say. I believe in free speech. Now shut up. That's all it amounts to. That's not free speech. That's propaganda. That's not principles. That's a total lack of principles. That's why there are so many questions that remain unanswered, because they can't answer you without telling you the truth. We operate on behalf of elite establishment interests. We'll say whatever we have to say to continue to pursue that agenda without ever making it too obvious. That's why there are going to be journalists in prison in some countries that we stick up for, and journalists in some countries that we completely ignore. Journalists that get murdered and we don't do anything about it, and it's business as usual. Julian Assange still in jail because he threatened American interests. You can just look at that information and work out for yourself what the truth is. So it doesn't matter what I think, but that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments below? If you enjoyed this, have a look at this. We do more of this stuff every single day. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one. Turn on the notification bell and subscribe. I've got a comedy special that you can watch for a few more days. There's a link in the description if you fancy watching it. But more important than any of that stuff is that you please stay free.